That's somebody's phone that's making that funny noise back there.
Just started the recording to Rich.
Oh, okay. Is it only 9:54? 9:58. Okay. The recording started. Great. So has anybody received offers from buyer's agents that are now requesting the seller pay for the buyer's broker's commissions? Nobody? Holden has 4. Wow. Very interesting. If they're not doing that, they're making a big mistake. Because they're not going to be compensated. If you want to be mean about it, I don't think we want to establish a reputation like that. Just my thought. It's almost 10 o'clock.
Oh no, I'm John's tenant in this example. Jeez.
What's going on?
I'm John's tenant in this example.
Uh-huh.
Jeez. We want to be his tenant.
Yeah, I don't want to be a John's tenant. Almost there. So fun. Just can't wait to hear what I have to say. Neither can I, right? What am I going to say today? Everybody has any fun things they'd like to share with us before we begin?
I don't have fun in my house.
You have fun at your house?
No, I'm not allowed fun.
Oh, you're not allowed fun at your house.
In band.
Sounds like a personal problem. I don't know. That's funny, Jonathan. Good morning, everybody. So I placed this form to begin with. This has nothing to do with our main discussion today, but as of July 1st, there is a restriction in regards to security deposits that you can collect. So if in the event the landlord, which is interesting, all these other forms are now called real property owners. Now this form still says landlord. I'm surprised that they did that. But this form will give an attestation of the landlord that the landlord is not subject to collecting only 1 month's security deposit. So I wanted to bring that up to you. So keep in mind, in terms of security deposits, California law now limits the amount that you can collect for furnished or unfurnished to 1 month, unless there's an exception. And the exception is associated with the landlord who owns no more than 2 separate alienable properties consisting of no more than 4 units. If they fall within that category, they can collect up to a 2-month security deposit, furnished or unfurnished. There's no differentiation any longer. And it also applies to persons that are or natural persons, or an LLC in which the members are natural persons. So if there's an LLC that owns a property and one of the entities that's a member is a corporation, that's going to be excluded from the exemption. So if it's an individual, Richard Moore, or my LLC, in which I'm the only member of that LLC, I can charge up to 2 months security deposit, but I'm going to have to give them this form to indicate that I can charge them up to 2 months security deposit. And I've already heard stories from other agents indicating that tenants are well aware of this, as a matter of fact. So keep that in mind. We don't want to put ourselves in an awkward position. And of course, another exemption is if somebody is a member of the armed services, you can't charge them more than 1 month security deposit. So on this form, under section 4, the landlord, if they believe they're exempt from the 1 month security deposit maximum, they would sign it, check the box under section 4, and then obviously we want the tenant to sign, but the tenant would respond if they're a member of the military. So keep that in mind. It's a big change, as a matter of fact.
What would be the penalty if you had, say, 3 properties and you got 2 months? What?
I have no idea what the penalty is, but all it takes is them filing a claim, and Rob Bonta, who is the Attorney General for the state of California, is probably going to make examples of people. So that's what we want to avoid. No question about that. And it's not enforceable anyways if you ask for 2 months security deposit. That's the other aspect.
If the owners sign the form, we should say only two, but after 1 year, they have 3 or 4. The owner have to return the security deposit.
No, but I would say upon renewal, my thinking is, and I haven't come across anything to validate this, but I would think if they're going to renew the lease upon expiration, they're gonna be subject to the guidelines now that they can no longer collect. Right now, if you have more than 1 month security deposit, you don't have to return the difference. So that's acceptable as a matter of fact. And then the other question that just came up recently, well, I'm a property owner, I'm a landlord, and I own multiple properties throughout the country. Is it only relegated to the number of units I own in California? No, it's not. So it's the total number of properties that you own. So I may own a property here, a duplex here, and a fourplex elsewhere. So I'm in the state of Arizona. So I am not going to meet the exemption. So it's not just relegated to properties that are owned in California. So a lot of people could be falling into this category in which they can no longer charge more than 1 month's security deposit.
Richard,
Any questions about that
yeah.
before we move on to the
Richard, can you hear me?
discussion everybody in the world is talking about?
What about if you own land? It's a question from Giselle.
If you own land, well, that's not a residential property. So I would say that's an exemption. That's not going to fall within the category of owning 2 separate alienable units of which there's no more than 4 units.
Richard, I have a question. Can you hear me?
That's a good question, though. Surprised I was ready for that. We're going to find out. Giselle's going to test me to see if I was actually correct about that. So today
Richard,
there's
can you
no
hear me?
longer an offer of
I
compensation.
can hear you, but I don't think Richard hear you. Hello?
So what should a buyer's
Okay,
broker
thanks.
do post MLS rules changes? Let's just go through the scenarios that CAR has provided for us. You're working with a buyer without a buyer representation agreement. Well, if you're going to show property, you're going to have to have some type of representation agreement. Currently, there's a buyer representation broker compensation agreement, which is exclusive and non-exclusive, or the PSRA, the property showing. And what is it again? Let's say property showing a representation agreement, and it's a limited form of an agreement. So the BRBC, it can no longer be, it can't be more than 3 months. It's not California law yet. It is going to be California law as of January 1st. So this is something we're applying or working, adhering to underneath the settlement that's taking place, but it's going to be California law. So that means ultimately as of January 1st, the Department of Real Estate is going to be involved in regards to any violations of these laws. So today it is a violation of the rules and regulations. As of January 1st, it's going to be a violation of law. That's going to be taking place. And of course, the fines are very severe. They're $2,500 for each fine. So if you're working with a buyer, you must have a representation agreement. You cannot show them property. That's all there is to it. And then if you make an offer, you are not protected. If you make an offer in which you're asking the seller to pay the buyer's broker's commission and you don't have a representation agreement, the seller has no obligation to pay the compensation that the buyer's negotiated on your behalf. And nor does the buyer have any obligation to pay you anything. So you're going to be working for free. And who wants to do that?
And for tenants?
For tenants, it is no different for tenants. As a matter of fact, so the representation agreements are necessary for tenants, buyers, so on and so forth. There's no longer an offer of compensation on the MLS for leases, but I don't think that's necessarily bad. We've just witnessed all these people offering $5 or $25, if you bring in a tenant. So it's not a bad situation, as a matter of fact, for someone representing a tenant.
It doesn't say on the TRBC whether 3 months is the maximum.
On the BRBC, it does actually. It
So I'm
specifies.
saying on the TRBC it doesn't. So I'm wondering if
Oh, the tenant representation
Yeah.
agreement. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. My misunderstanding.
I was just wondering if it's still safe.
I think that that's a very good question. I haven't come across anything then. If that's something that's going to be different than what I'm familiar with, I think that's,
Yeah, they don't care.
if it doesn't say it, if it's not capping at this point in time. I'm glad you brought that up because I wasn't really aware of that. Thank you.
One more time, starting today,
Mhm.
I cannot go to a lease property without having them sign up before.
That is correct. You cannot show any property, even if it's a property that's for lease, without having a representation agreement signed with the prospective tenant.
And the one or two acceptable forms, I can maybe have them sign. Like, do I have them sign it electronically before I get there? Do I have them sign it on the hood of my car? Do I have them sign it? Like, so do I have to sign?
Well, that's a good question. You know, what is your discussion going to consist of, whether it's a buyer or tenant? Aren't they going to be, first of all, they're going to be wondering what's taking place. And what Carr continues to suggest over and over again is to use the broker's commission advisory. And it talks about specifically, let me just pull it up because that's a very good question. Broker's compensation advisory. So here, let's just go over a few of the headlines in it, because I think this could be helpful in regards to you explaining it to a potential client. So we already know that listing agreement compensation is fully negotiable. It's never been different in the past, as a matter of fact. And then optional additional compensation if buyers is unrepresented. Remember, this is going to apply typically to a listing in which I convince the seller to say, you're going to pay me 3% to list your property for lease or for sale. But then there's another cell in there that says, if the tenant and or buyer is unrepresented, you're going to pay me an additional amount of compensation. So that's what this is talking about in regards to specific item B. But I don't think that's helpful in regards to the discussion, as a matter of fact. And then broker may represent both buyer and seller dual agency. That's something that's permitted by law. Buyer representation compensation is fully negotiable. And then under section 2B, requirement for written agreements, it talks about the settlement, it talks about the lawsuit, and it talks about our obligation to have a signed representation agreement. So I think that's going to be one of the most important things that you can present to somebody when you're asking them to sign this contract. So with a limited representation agreement, it can be 30 days, but for the typical representation agreement, it's 90 days. But as you pointed out, for the tenant representation agreement, the TRBC, there has no limitation on there. And I don't know if California law is going to limit that time frame in regards to tenant representation.
So could I just do like a OHNA? Like the open.
To show property? Absolutely not.
Can't do that?
No, the OHNA, right? Open house advisory, no. If you're representing a tenant and you just want to show them properties, are you actually holding that property open for viewing? Is it an open house?
If I technically had 3 people show up. Could I do
Are you the listing agent?
that?
I would say absolutely not.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say no, if you want to follow the law.
Only form, so that I'm clear, is you're saying I have to have everyone sign either the broker compensation advisory.
Tenant representation.
or
The tenant representation broker commission form,
So tenant representation broker.
yes. It has to be signed, yes. Unfortunately, to show any property, there's really no difference in regards to whether it's a for sale or for lease property.
There's a question. Who verifies if you have a buyer agreement?
Nobody verifies if you have an agreement. I would say if somebody's making that representation that they have an agreement with a buyer or tenant, that if they don't, they're pretty foolish because they're not going to be compensated.
Still my same question, I still have questions.
No, that's fine, Gene. That's I think it's great. Thank you.
So you have this lease that you're showing for another agent. Okay. And you're saying I have to have them sign the tenant representation.
It's your listing.
It's not my listing.
Okay, it's not your listing. You're working with another agent who claims they have a representation agreement with that client.
With the landlord, right?
They don't have an agreement with the client, just with the
They don't have
landlord.
it.
With the landlord. That sounds like a listing contract.
So I'm just saying that I'm just showing the product,
Uh-huh.
right? I'm working with an agent. they asked me to go ahead and show the properties for them,
Uh-huh.
when people are curious about the property website.
You can enter just that property address, so that
Not on the
contract's only good for that property
tenant
address.
But on the OHNA, you could, that's the reason why I was like, maybe you just. leave the OHNA.
Why would you, I have to ask, first of all, why would you be showing a lease listing for another agent and you have nothing involved?
Because I could end up representing the tenant.
All right, so that's the goal, right?
Then
So
you're
you
saying
must have their representation agreement signed
The only form acceptable is tenant representation.
at this moment in time, from what I'm aware, for leases. Yeah, if you're showing property, then you have to have that signed. If you're the listing agent, you possibly, if you're holding an open house, you could use the open house advisory OHNA, or you could have them sign the TRBC also.
So if you are a listing agent, you're a listing agent,
Mhm.
you have a property on the MLS. And you don't have an open house yet. Okay, so
Right.
open house scheduled. And you're going to have, and someone calls up and says, hey, I'd like to take a look at your property. And then they don't have an agent to
Mhm.
represent them, then you have them sign the broker compensation.
Yes, but there is one other form that I forgot to mention, and that would be the buyer non-agency agreement. So you theoretically could have them sign the non-agency agreement because they wish to have no representation by a realtor. You could, or you could just say, I'm not going to show you the property, and I can't answer any questions for you. Ms. Sue, do you have a question?
Yes. This is done.
I'm not sure. Don't worry, she's not done. Her mind is reeling. I see the smoke over there, so there's.
That's why we're having this.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions that are valid.
And just if I have a new client reaching out to me, and then I ask them if they have any representation with another agent, by law, they have to actually share that representation with me.
I mean, the agreement? No, they need to disclose that to you, because if they don't, and they don't, you don't exclude that from your representation agreement, they could be obligated to pay the original agent plus you. So they're putting themselves in a very awkward position by not telling you truthfully that they already have an agreement signed with an agent.
I see. And then if I have it like in the form of like email,
Uh-huh.
just that's it, because verbal confirmation is not gonna be anything, right?
Well, I think that's helpful, defending yourself. Ultimately, it comes down that there are two representation agreements signed, and now that buyer or tenant has to pay both agents. And you asked them and they said, no, I haven't signed any other agreements. I would say that's a pretty defensible position in regards to collecting the money we should be entitled to.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Just in any form of writing. Maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Verbal, are they going to say, well, Masood never asked me, but if you have something documenting you asked that question, if you signed any other representation agreements, and if they have, there's no reason to not ask for a copy of that.
Okay.
That would be my approach, right?
So I was gonna look for a long
Yeah,
question
It
there.
is, okay.
I have this question. So
I'm sorry, I'll get to you in just a minute here. Yeah. Let's see, the question is, I have an agreement in place with a buyer to charge a 2% commission regardless of the situation. There's an extra 0.5% or 1%, I will give it back to the buyer as a closing cost credit. Can I put 2.5% on the buyer broker agreement and state that 0.5% will go back to the buyer on a separate addendum? No, you cannot do that. You cannot, as a matter of fact, there is a modification to the buyer representation agreement, assuming you use the past buyer representation agreement. So now you'd be required to modify that buyer representation agreement, stating that I cannot collect anything more than what you agreed to pay me, no matter what anyone else is willing to pay me. So if I said on the former buyer representation agreement, I want to get 2%, and you, Mr. Buyer, you'll get the benefit if the offer of compensation is more than that, or if I can negotiate more, no more then 2% can be collected, and the buyer representation modification agreement specifically tells the buyer, you will not collect anything.
And you're gonna have to provide proof of your agreement to the listing side.
Yeah, ultimately, not at the time you make an offer. So Giselle, in your case, that money that the buyer was counting on is lost. So how can you not leave money on the table?
Well, they're not offering anything to start with, so you're not leaving anything on the table.
Well, I think your representation agreement is going to state the maximum amount of money that you're going to earn. Anything offered in excess of that will not benefit you, nor will it benefit your buyer. That's the way these forms, that's the way the whole settlement, that's the way the law is coming down now. So before you can entice a buyer to say, sign my representation agreement, I'm only going to collect 2%, and most likely the offer compensation is 3% on the MLS, and I'm going to rebate that 1% back to you. No more. That money is that differential, that 1% in my example is lost.
So Giselle, no longer will it show the compensation on the MLS, so there's nothing being shown. She's saying.
Yeah.
That she's. offering
Correct.
2%.
There's no more compensation being listed on the MLS. As a matter of fact, I don't have the exact answer to this, but before, if somebody would submit an offer and the offer of compensation was on the MLS, actually, if you told the listing agent, I'm going to submit an offer, and the offer wasn't received until later in the day, for example, and the next day the listing agent changed the offer of compensation and reduced it, you're still entitled to the compensation was offered on the MLS. So now what I've read, I have conflicting information with that. And now Carr is saying, well, if you made an offer and you didn't negotiate to have the seller pay the buyer's broker's commissions, and you relied on the information that was in the MLS, you may not be entitled to compensation simply because you submitted an offer. It may require an accepted offer for the listing agent to honor the compensation that was on the MLS formerly.
So Richard, based on that, can I ask, in that agreement, can I ask for like 3% and then give a 0.5% on a different addendum?
A different addendum to who? The buyer? So you're going to have a buyer representation agreement in which the buyer states are going to pay you 3%. And then you're going to have another addendum behind that saying you're going to kick back 1%.
Not now, but when we are in a escrow, yes.
All right. Well, I would say that, first of all, the law states it must be a definitive amount. So in my opinion, you can't collect more than 2%.
So
You're saying you want a representation agreement signed with your buyer for 3%, right? You're obligating the buyer. And you negotiate with the seller to pay. The buyer negotiates with the seller to have the seller pay your commission of 3%.
but I want to give a credit back to my buyer.
I think that's a good question, but the point is, I don't know if you can do that. Because your compensation must be fixed. They're saying whatever you state in a buyer representation agreement, that's what you're going to earn.
No, I thought that not above that, but how about less than that?
I understand what you're saying. The buyer
Because-
compensation agreement states exactly what you're going to earn. It doesn't state, if you want to, you can rebate some of the money back to them.
Yeah, that's what I understand.
And I don't think you can do that.
No?
I don't think you can do that, right?
Because in the past we were.
Yeah, I know in the past, a lot of things have changed since then. So I don't think that that's something that's available to you. I think the better approach would be, I'll get you guys just a minute, to negotiate. First of all, if you're getting a loan, a lender's going to look at the amount of concessions and they're going to cap the concessions, right? But in the purchase contract, concessions and commissions are broken out separately. So right now, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the VA, they're not looking at the maximum concession as including the commission if you break it out separately. They're going to look at the concession that's on, I forgot which line item, to cover closing costs on the RPA. So that's why this RPA still breaks out commissions that the seller's paying because it's not considered a concession. It can be, but it's also breaking out concessions separately. Does that make sense? Was I clear about that? So anytime you get a loan and you're asking the seller to pay closing costs, the lender is going to cap the amount of closing costs that the seller can pay, or that the agent can credit back. Doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
But what the lender's not going to do, if you break out the commission separately, is consider that as a concession.
I
So
don't-
your commission's not a concession, the 2% you're giving.
So, okay, so on the purchase contract, let me see if I have a purchase contract. Uh-huh. Okay. Her original question was, I negotiated with my buyer, my representation agreement, that the buyer's going to pay me 3%. And then afterwards, or during escrow, I'm going to credit that buyer 1%.
This is assuming that the seller agrees to pay for it.
Yeah, that's just assumption. She negotiates, or we negotiate 3%. But in the end, we want to push in 1% back. I get it. that part. But then I lost you at the part where you started saying.
I don't know. I think that's a very good question. I can't sit here and say categorically that that's going to be acceptable to kick them back 1%.
Would you be,
Because
I think that's a very good question. Well,
wouldn't you be better off just saying 2% commission and then ask the seller to pay 1% for the buyer's closing costs? Because usually you can have them pay up to 3 or sometimes even more. And then that way your buyer will get the credit they need. And actually the seller would feel better giving less commission and giving something to the buyer than the way you had phrased it, Roya. You know, saying 3 and then you giving 1 back.
I think strategy, I think that's a better strategy than kicking back, because the seller's going to look adversely on the 3% that you're asking the seller to pay you. That's just my opinion.
So you separate the two.
Yeah, that would be, I think, maybe a better approach in regards to doing it. But as I said, supposedly the representation agreement, it's a definitive amount that you're collecting. Can you credit back a portion of that? Well, quite possibly, but I'll have to confirm that. I think that's a very good
You
question.
know what, the reason that I said, because on an agreement, it also writing between the purchase price would be between this price to this price.
On the what now?
You know, on the agreement,
Mm-hmm.
it said the purchase price, like what county, what purchase.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, the value of the houses. So for instance, when I'm saying between 500 to 1 million, so it's such a big difference in the price. And sometimes, you know, even the people that they want to go with the higher, they might, in the middle of a way, they change their mind, want to go something smaller.
Mhm.
So I was thinking that if I do have that option to negotiate, or just this way, not only negotiate, but earn that I give it.
Well,
back
I think no
to
matter
them.
what, the seller, if you make an offer on a property and you're asking the seller to pay 3% and they agree, the seller's entitled to that representation agreement. So if you have a representation agreement and you have an addendum modifying it, I would say that the seller is entitled to see that modification to the representation agreement.
Yeah, even right now, they have to sign on it.
No, my point is, you're asking for 3%, the seller agrees.
Oh.
The seller is entitled to get documentation
I-
that the buyer signed. So now they're going to see, if you withhold that document, I think that's an awkward position, right? Because now realistically, you're only collecting 2%. So why would the seller pay anything more than what the buyer's obligated to pay you? Why would the seller pay anything more than what the buyer's obligated to pay you? So I think that in itself is going to defeat your thought of negotiating a transaction like that.
No, I mean, the buyer agreed to pay me higher.
Yeah, but the buyer also agreed, you also agreed to kick back the buyer 1% of your commission, right?
Yeah, but
That's an
not-
addendum.
Not in a writing, verbally.
So if you want to give them a gift after
Okay.
close of escrow, you can give them a gift after close of escrow.
Yeah, well, I-
Please, he will say why I'll pay you more. If
Well,
I
that's
pay
good
more.
that you can convince your clients to do that.
Yeah. because it would be more important to have the buyer to sign the representation agreement. So if you convince the buyer to say, okay, I write 3%, but then says the buyer, there's no obligation to pay more than seller's files and commissions.
You can't do that.
No, you can't.
No. So if you say 3%, that's what you're obligating the buyer. This is the whole thing. More or less, this is what the buyer's obligated to pay, and that's what it's getting at. Contract is just like a listing contract or a purchase contract. That's the obligation. But what the seller can do, or the rental property owner can do, if you ask for 3%, they can negotiate the commissions that the buyer's asking the seller or landlord to pay the buyer's agent. I ask for 3%, the seller comes back and says, I'm only going to pay your agent 2%. So that's actually permissible. There's no CAR form that addresses that, but you can do that.
That could be part of
But
the
then
counter
they will
offer,
tell the
right?
buyer, but then they will tell the buyer there's no obligation to pay more than seller's fair.
That's, the point is, that's not the way the settlement and the law is going to be. Once you have that contract signed, that is the buyer's obligation. That's the way it's designed, as a matter of fact. There's no more flexibility.
It's gonna create
You
another,
just can't collect more than what that buyer representation agreement is.
it's gonna create another class action lawsuit.
Loophole also, because earlier also buyer never used to sign those papers.
A loophole? No.
You know, because right now also they can say that I don't want to sign the paper.
Then you're not gonna show them property, are you? Are you
Nobody's
gonna
gonna show them problems.
submit yourself to a $2,500 fine and eventually a violation of California law beginning January? And then you know they're gonna make examples of people, and you know your fellow agents are going to be telling on you. And not only that, but if you don't have a representation agreement and you show them property, you're not entitled to collect any money. You're wasting your time. And my response to somebody would be, are you willing to work with an unscrupulous agent as opposed to me? I'm presenting you the documentation. I'm gonna follow the law. What kind of presentation are you giving them?
I'm on the vein. of this
Do what now?
question. I'm on the vein of this question,
Uh-huh.
but I'm trying to just understand the past. I helped out a family member. The commission amount of compensations on the MLS, let's just say, for argument's sake, it's 2%, right? When towards the end of escrow, I gave as a gift in escrow, part of my compensation to my cousin. Right?
Uh-huh.
Nobody felt it was awkward. You know, nobody called me out. The seller didn't call me out on it. The listing agent didn't call me out on it. And I'm just wondering if that exact scenario happens again in the future.
I would say no.
What is the form that is like saying that I can't do that? What is the form?
The law, the settlement.
The specific law is saying.
Yes, it is saying on that representation agreement, this is what you're going to earn. No more, no less.
No more, no less.
Yes.
So you're saying,
That's my opinion in regards to the no less aspect.
you're saying basically the law states that a real estate agent representing the buyer can no longer give them a gift of some sort through escrow.
Well, I think it comes down to what was the intent of your arrangement?
What was
So-
the intent of me giving my cousin?
You went in with the intent of giving a credit back to them, didn't you?
Yes.
Okay, that's all right. So you just admitted that. So I asked the seller to pay.
Originally? No, just thought about it later on.
Oh, do you think anyone's gonna believe that?
Well, nobody gave me a hard time about it, so I'm just kind of.
That was then.
That was then. So
Mhm.
I'm still trying to point to the part of the legal document that states that the seller is going to have an issue with them.
Well, in terms of, we'll go through that right now. So I can show you why I'm giving you my opinion.
Which I appreciate.
All right, yeah, thank you.
Right, you're using their obligated debt to you. It's just,
Yeah, so this is the buyer representation agreement. And it talks about the representation period, property type, location, properties excluded, amount of compensation. Let's say E1 4B. And it talks about brokers shall not receive any amount in excess of 2E1, right? The amount of compensation. So we've negotiated let's say a 3% buyer representation agreement with your family member.
Sure.
And then you decide later on, you're going to credit back 1%.
Basically.
Okay. So now the seller is entitled to actually see what the compensation is that you're earning. They're entitled to the signature page or the last page of this document to verify that what you stated is true. Now they look at that and say, you're collecting 3%. Pardon me?
Which part are we gonna?
Which part are we going to say?
Scroll down.
Okay, well, in the purchase contract, it talks about that, but the last page, you're going to be showing them, see, there's two different aspects of this buyer representation agreement. You're going to see in section E1, it's going to say maybe 3% of the acquisition price. And then once again, in section 16, confirmation of compensation. This is the page that the seller is entitled to request from you. And not only that, but if the seller isn't paying any compensation, that is the page you would submit to escrow, and it's an irrevocable demand to pay compensation. Because escrow has never had any other documentation submitted to them in the past. They never see the buyer representation agreements. They always rely on the listing agent, then the commission instructions went out to confirm the compensation that was being paid. So when you submit an offer, are you obligated to provide the buyer representation broker compensation contract? No, you're not. Nor are you obligated to provide them with this last page. And I don't like this because it gives all the contact information. But this is what Carr's suggestion is, right? That we use this last page.
Are we allowed to redact that part?
I would say absolutely, right?
To redact the second half of it. If you know in the first.
At least the
part,
contact information. What was that now?
When I read section 16, confirmation.
Yeah,
Scroll up.
okay.
Confirmation of compensation. Buyer confirmed that the compensation specified in paragraph 2E1 for brokers, services, blah, 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 blah. That's the specific part that you're citing of why we can't do what we've done. Is that
I believe that this is saying, this is what I'm paying my agent. And you, as generous as you were, and maybe it wasn't even contemplated, now kick back 1% of what I'm obligated to pay you.
Sure. But that would be the discretion of the buyer's agent. At what point does the seller get notified that I've given 1% up to?
That's a good question. How are they notified, or if they're notified? They may not be notified because I would say they're not notified because they're not going to see the buyer's side of the settlement statement.
So they're gonna see this part, but they never see the buyer's side of the settlement statement. That's really the part that I'm trying to understand. I'm sorry, Richard, I'm asking so many questions about this, but I really do want to understand the language. But I see this part, and I'm just trying to think of the process of escrow. I don't think there's a part where.
I guess, are we telling the truth in regards to what the buyer's obligation for the compensation due you is? Are we actually being truthful?
Is it a free country for the seller to agree to pay for my compensation? You can choose to pay it, not pay it, pay for a portion of it.
Yeah,
Is it a free country that I'm in, that I decide that I want to give part of my commission out to a family member or as a gift?
Well, I'll verify this, but I don't think we're as free as you think here. I think that's part of the problem. You can't charge more than 1 month security deposit any longer. There's all of these other implications. There are limitations in regards to how much rent you can charge. We're not living in a free society any longer, especially in this state.
I think people are going to try to start doing this and get creative with it, and then
I think that's very creative.
it's going to create another lawsuit.
So
That's what I think.
This is the confusing part, because I've been kind of drowning myself in podcasts about the BACs and all that stuff since it's all coming down. And a couple of the podcasts are saying, like, in the negotiations, do what she's talking about. What they're talking about kicking back 1%, or if you get 4% kickback, whatever. So yeah, I think there's a little confusion on whether or not, like you're saying, that.
Whether it's actually going to be permissible.
Yes, yes.
Are we misleading the seller in regards to the compensation that we negotiated?
I finished the ABR training. 2 days of my life to do that.
Uh-huh.
Recently. And in listening to that, of course, the training is national. So I understand every state's a little bit different. So they're speaking to thousands of agents about the ABR training, right? Trying to give us best practices for this. And I'm asking these questions because I wasn't really sure, because he kept saying in the meeting, you have to go back to your broker. You have to go back to your broker in California to figure that out, because it's gonna be different in North Carolina.
I think that's fair. And, actually, I see the same type of recommendations from CAR. Speak to your broker about their office policy. It's not as if this is perfectly clear, unfortunately.
And I understand.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question, though. Can you do that without violating the agreement?
Well, here's another thing. They agreed to pay you a commission, and now they negotiated for someone else to pay that commission, their obligation. And then now they want money in addition to that? Like, shouldn't the commission being paid for it be enough?
Let's talk about the kindness of Gina's part, okay? We all know I'm kind, right? I'm trying to just look at the different aspects of it, right?
Well, I have to say, what benefit is there for you to negotiate a 3% commission? And I understand this, to cover closing costs, right? To kick them back $15,000. Isn't the buyer better off paying $15,000 less? Yes, there are buyers that don't have sufficient money to cover all their closing costs, but isn't it a better presentation maybe to just ask for those concessions to cover the closing costs as opposed to you expressing your generosity?
Yeah, but you know what, Richard, I'll tell you, you're thinking from an efficiency and that standpoint, and I'm thinking from a saleswoman standpoint. And from a building equity, building relationships standpoint, which is I think what most agents are thinking.
So do you think your client's going to say, oh, 3% sounds great to me, Gina, and yes, I understand verbally, you're going to kick me back 1%, so I'm only paying
No, I'm
2%?
not going to do that.
Oh, no, I'm just wondering, is that what your presentation is?
About the flexibility that it
Uh-huh,
has. So
yeah.
when we're out there in the field, and we have to sell this, and get everybody to sign this, you do have to understand, what are we allowed to do and what are we not? Because I'm also a rule, you know me, I'm a rule stickler. I don't really. I'm working
Yes, I understand that. I don't disagree, Gina. I think presentation is everything, and having some flexibility is also very, very important.
Because like when you're out there and if you're trying to get this one, like someone to sign this,
Mhm.
and then each of us have our own ways of presentation, right? And you just need to know what are we.
I think, so often in regards to any type of questions like that, it goes down to intent. Was that your intent all along to do that realistically? And then I'm not going to use this as maybe a bad term, but defraud the seller saying, I'm collecting 3%. But really, that was never my intent to do that. And I think that's what any of the opposing attorney would say. That's just a guess on my behalf. That was never in your intent. You just negotiated with the seller to collect 3% because you knew you were going to kick back 1%. So I don't know the answer, and I will confirm that. I think that's a very good question. But I think intent always comes down to any type of issue. And if a seller finds out, how do they find out? They very well, and maybe, they're not going to see the settlement statement. They shouldn't see what you're earning. But, also the listing agent is never required to disclose how much they are earning, by the way. But what will be disclosed on the MLS when we're talking about closing costs, there's going to be an array of different line items for closing costs, concessions, and one of the other line items is going to be commissions that the seller paid. That's something that the listing agent is going to have to place on the MLS.
Jeff has a question up here.
Okay. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to change that. Sorry, let's say, but do you need a BNA, is a buyer non-agency, and everyone coming to your open house if you're using the open house advisory? And with the BNA, you can't engage about the property at all, or if they don't want to sign anything, correct. But the OHNA, you can engage, but only from the seller's position. So you don't, if they won't sign anything, the worst case is theoretically you should have a buyer non-agency agreement signed. And it just tells them, I am not representing you. And they've agreed to the fact that you're not representing them. The OHNA addresses the same thing. It states that I am not representing you. Any information I'm giving you is simply on behalf of the seller. So I don't see any reason to do both, but you should do one or the other in terms of risk management. So the buyer non-agency agreements, if you're holding an open house, remember open houses are separately defined from just simply showing property or providing a property tour. So keep that in mind. But the OHNA, I think that would be my approach, was anyone walking into the house that they should be signing that. At least it tells them you're collecting information. You're also asking them, do they have an existing relationship with a broker? And they should be able to write down the name of the agent they're working with. I think most people, they're signing a buyer representation agreement, are going to remember the name of the broker they're working with for the most part.
And if they say no.
If they
If
lie,
they say that, you know what, I'm talking, but it's not an agreement yet. So what should be?
well, you should have the open house, the OHNA signed, or you should have a buyer non-agency agreement signed. That's really the ideal situation. Otherwise, they could be under the impression any information you're giving them is due to the fact that you have an agency relationship, and that could be violating the settlement and ultimately the law. And you have to wonder, this is something Jeff pointed out to me before, is someone to be sending out shoppers, right? Used to do that in residential development. So we would send clients or people that we would pay to act as clients to the sales offices and act as if they're buyers to see what our sales agents were doing. So is that going to be the same approach here? I don't know, but it's certainly something that's not new to the real estate industry, is sending people out there that are not actual buyers to question you, to put you in an awkward position. So I have just these questions I would like to run through. No, I'm not done yet. I'm sorry, before I even get to that. So now, how about individuals that have listing contracts? And guess what? On a listing contract, it states how much money we're supposed to be offering to the cooperating broker. So you're going to have to modify those existing listing contracts. There's a modification of listing contract, and it's going to ask, do you want to pay me the additional money, Mr. Seller or Miss Seller, for the money we're offering to the cooperating broker? Or if you don't choose that option, then your commission agreement with me is going to be reduced by the amount of compensation that you agree to offer on the MLS. Typically, not always, when we sign a listing contract, a former listing contract, we said it's a 5% listing, we're going to offer 2.5% to the cooperating broker. So if we fill that in, we can no longer offer compensation on the MLS. So it's a direct violation of the settlement and what will be law. So we have to modify that listing contract to address that.
So if I do already have a contract with the agent, so.
No, with a seller.
As an example, I'm a seller.
Mm-hmm.
I have a contract.
Mm-hmm.
So I can call the agent and I said, I only want to give your commission from now on. I don't want to give the buyer's commission. So we need to make some changes.
Yes, actually, us as a listing agent should be initiating that discussion. Because otherwise, if we don't initiate it, if we don't modify that existing listing contract, we're in violation of the settlement. Because we said that we're going to offer compensation on the MLS. That's what we said in that listing contract. You agreed, Mr. Seller, and I'm going to put the offer of compensation on the MLS. But I can no longer do that. I can't fulfill that aspect of my listing contract any longer, or my agreement with you.
Reach out to seller and they ask for it.
And yes, and have them sign a modification of that listing.
Yeah, and every county is different, right?
Every county? No.
California.
No,
So they all started today?
no, it's the MLS. So CRMLS, which is the largest MLS in California, now implemented their change today. But it can, for any other remaining MLS, it can be no later than the 17th of August. So I know there's been questions about that also, but for CRMLS, the obligations, the change took place today.
And if you don't hear from the other agent, I mean, as a seller, if I don't hear it from the agent,
Well, you're violating the settlement and you're in violation of what will be the law.
me as a seller or the,
You as the listing agent.
oh. No, I'm just saying I'm a seller, so the listing agent is.
The listing agent is required to initiate the discussion with the seller.
And if she doesn't, then she's in a violation.
Yes. And then the other question comes up, well, if I took a listing contract, but because I'm so clever, I never wrote in the amount of money that's to be offered to the cooperating broker. Right? We do that all the time. That would be the way I would take a listing contract if I could do it. So you still, it talks about the offer of compensation. I would say you probably still have an obligation to modify that listing contract, to let them know. Because most likely the seller's impression is out of a 5% listing, you're going to offer a portion of that to the cooperating broker. My guess is that would have been a part of the discussion anyways at that listing presentation. So unpleasant discussion.
And to find out about that, we're going back to the listing agreement. On a listing agreement, if for instance, say 5%, 2.5% I keep 2.5% the other agent.
If you filled it out that way.
Yeah.
If you didn't fill it out that way, you just said 5% and you're going to leave it up to your broker's cooperation policy, then we don't know exactly what that amount is going to be, but it does state specifically that the seller's authorizing and we agree to offer compensation on the MLS, even though we never specified the amount in that listing contract to be offered to the cooperating broker. Gina?
On the car website, there is a video right now in the FAQs section that says, in regards to compensation, buyer's agent should not be working for free, basically. And it says there are many ways in which buyer's agent will be compensated. One way will be through the buyer. One way will be through the seller. One way will be through the seller's agent. Very short video, but it does say that. So I'm curious, how is it through the listing agent? If the listing.
Right now, there is nothing facilitating the compensation to be paid from a listing agent to the cooperating broker. So right now, in my Q&A that I have that I was going to show you, it's saying the third option doesn't include that. It's just saying if the seller's unrepresented, you can have a single party compensation agreement signed. So in terms of how we obligate the cooperating broker to offer that compensation, I'd say it's going to be almost impossible because right now, the new listing contract does not even ask the seller to pay any compensation to a cooperating broker. Now, maybe we could design the listing contracts such that I'm the listing agent and I want 6%. And if there is a broker that wants me to pay a portion of it or to compensate them through the 6%, there might be something we can do. But CAR has effectively removed all of these forms that simplified our lives. So for example, the form CBC, cooperating broker compensation form, it's been eliminated. So we can have used that form to modify the compensation that was on the MLS, or we could have used that form to ratify the compensation that the listing agent was going to be paying the buyer's broker. But they've eliminated that completely. They don't want any compensation being paid from a listing agent to a buyer's broker, even though it's not deemed to be illegal, but they're trying to avoid that at all costs. So as time goes on, maybe we get really clever and we come up with something, to facilitate that. But I think it's going to be, you're going to have to modify that listing contract that's now available as of July 2024 to have the seller agree to pay the buyer's broker's compensation. But I think that's illegal anyways. That's really what it's coming down to. There's no obligation for them to do that.
So if there's no obligation, there is still choice, though, you're saying?
Well, I guess there can be a choice. You know, it can't, how do you put that into? You could put something in the listing contract in which the seller, I guess, is obligating themselves to pay the buyer's brokerage commission.
Because I can see the problem, like in that one section where it says, I'm gonna pay the listing agent X amount. But let's say you say, oh, I'm gonna pay the listing 5%. But then how do you force your own listing agent to extend 2% to a buyer's agent? It would be via addendum.
Yeah, and there's nothing that they're posting on the MLS.
But as a seller, I'm a seller, and I was like, hey, I want to cast a wide net. I want to pay 2%. In the past, I paid it directly to my seller's agent. I want you to handle it or whatever. Just use your discretion.
Well, you can also use the concession field on the MLS. It's not binding, but you could say 2% in there, and at least it sends the message to the cooperating broker that the seller is willing to pay that.
You still can't put it in the concession.
You can put it, yeah, it can be a percentage or a fixed dollar amount in the concession field, but once again, it's not binding. And you would have to ratify that through, I think it's 3G3 on the RPA, and submit a seller payment to buyer's broker form.
And that concession amount is, that the word concession is to be used for request for repairs. Could it be also like paying down funds for warranty?
Yes, it could include commissions. It could include commissions, but that's the whole benefit of separating commissions out separately, because lenders are going to limit the concessions, but they're not going to look at, if you break out commissions for the buyer's broker separately, they're not going to include that in their calculation of a 3% cap, for example. Does that make sense? All right. Anybody have a question about that? Well, I have to say, this is a much better discussion.
Another question from a couple of questions.
Okay.
Surely, do we need to take these forms to our open house in case we need to get one signed?
Absolutely. You should be taking multiple copies of all these forms with you to the open house. You should print out the open house advisory, the OHNA. Now that has multiple line items for people to sign. It's like a sign-in sheet. So you don't need as many copies, but you should also bring the PSRA, or the limited compensation agreement, and the BRBC with you. You should have those available with you.
And if a couple of people come at the same time, you stop them and ask them to do this.
Absolutely. I wouldn't want them coming into the house myself. That's wrong for me to say that. I don't know what I would do specifically. I guess if people are obstinate, but if you make them aware of the law, they need to sign this in. At minimum, you want that sign-in sheet, the OHNA signed. They don't have to sign in or type a representation agreement. I think no matter what, they're all going to be nervous about signing anything. At least the OHNA has limited verbiage that so you could quickly explain to somebody, saying, you are not obligated. This tells you that I am not representing you in any way, and information I give you is simply to benefit the seller. There's only a few paragraphs in that form.
In an open house that the family came together.
Huh?
Then after I start having a conversation with them, you know, the father was introducing himself. But at the end, the father was buying a house for his son under his children's name. So if I wasn't entering into this conversation, I never would find out. Just getting a information about a father, you know, I thought that he would be a buyer. So in the case that the family come together, so the first question is that, are you going to buy a house for yourself, or who's going to be it, right?
Who are the buyers? Actually, I think the way to circumvent that is to say anyone that's an adult over age 18 should sign the sign-in sheet.
Sorry, I don't know what's going on every time. I apologize.
That's okay. Sarah?
Yeah, in the listing contract, so we said we have to modify to the new law, but what if in the listing contract agreement, But, 6% commission on the first side, or you didn't mention it about the percentage of dollars.
Mhm.
Side, buyer side. So, and then we asked the seller, are you gonna still pay for the buyer's agent commission if they said pay with that? So we still something to modify or?
Well, let me ask you this, in those discussions, even though it wasn't written out in the contract, was there a discussion that you were going to offer 2% out of that 6% gross listing commission? Was there ever a discussion about that? Or do you believe the seller thought that you yourself would earn 6%?
So, yeah, it's the first, that is, if you you this agreement, so first, we were saying about the 6%, so we got, we're gonna split it with the buyers.
So you had that discussion?
Yeah.
Did you talk about, you said split, so that would suggest, in your example, 3% and 3%, right?
Yeah. That's all.
So I think that kind of brings us to the answer that you should give consideration to modifying the contract to state that you're going to be paid 3%. Now, the modification, once again, could just say that the seller could be so happy with you, I'm going to just allow you to earn the full 6%. See, the problem with the existing listing contract is it states that we're going to be offering compensation on the MLS, and we no longer can do that.
So what if, the seller doesn't matter, so, if we split or we taking the whole? If
It doesn't
they-
matter.
Yeah, if they doesn't matter, they just want to sell it, but they want to sell the price.
Well, the modification to the listing contract gives that option. The seller just agrees to pay you the full 6%, or the seller does not agree to pay you the full 6%, and the listing contract is reduced by the amount that you agreed to offer to the cooperating broker. And I understand in your example, we never had anything written in there, and that makes it more complex. But the problem is in the listing contract, we talk about specifically the offer of compensation we're going to be making on the MLS, and no longer are we entitled, or can we do that? So I think from one standpoint, I probably just allow this listing contract just to continue if I never specify the compensation.
Mention it, if new law changes like this, but you want to still keep this agreement with us, or?
Why would, the listing contract isn't going to be terminated. I would just say maybe the compensation to you or the total compensation will be modified. But I would think, let's assume in your example, we never had a discussion with the seller. And if somebody's going to make an offer, they're going to make an offer on behalf of a buyer and they want 3% out of that 6%. What I would suggest doing is that you would just issue a credit back to the seller for 3%, and the seller would agree to pay the buyer's broker 3%. That would probably be the easiest way to facilitate something like that. Because that would have been the expectation of the seller. You keep the full 6%, but are they going to want to pay 6% and 3%? Are they going to be very disappointed?
Yes, but, it's legally, if you put the state in the agreement, it's gonna be a problem, or?
I'd say legally, if it comes down to it, and we're going to try and collect 6% in your example, and the seller also agrees to pay the buyer's broker, because we didn't modify that contract, I think it's going to be hard to defend. Because no longer can you offer compensation on the MLS, and that was, even though you didn't specify the percentage, the contract says based upon the broker's policy, and you had a discussion with them saying you were going to be offering compensation to the buyer's broker.
Is the listing agent obligated to inform them?
Yes. Oh, that was the question?
Yeah.
Okay,
So you're obligated to have that discussion regardless.
you are. It's not as clear if you didn't specify how much compensation is being offered to the cooperating broker, but the other aspect of the contract is clear. We can no longer offer compensation. So the modification addresses that, as a matter of
So
fact.
basically, you're not able to say anything in MLS, but if you are calling listing agent and you can check with them that they are offering it.
That is correct. That is correct. And that's not binding, it's meaningless. So you have to negotiate that in the contract, but at least it tells you what you should be able to expect. And then if you had a buyer representation agreement before the most recent release, you have an obligation to amend that, because there can be examples in which we stated we want 2%, and anything over and above that is going to benefit you, Mr. and Ms. Buyer. Well, that's no longer the case, because you cannot collect anything more than what's on that buyer representation agreement. That's already 11 o'clock, huh? Let's see. We've talked about a lot of these things, but I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Oh, and this is something interesting. Under the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement, it talks about the requirement of the buyer to provide relevant financial information. So Carr is saying that's an obligation. So if somebody doesn't have the ability to pay your compensation, or maybe there's a loan program that prohibits it, that's going to be a problem for you. And so you need to make sure that you get that information from them. The buyer financial, what is it now? Where is it? Buyer financial and personal information form. It's all part and associated with the new buyer representation agreement. And does the RLA, the residential listing agreement, have a field for cooperating broker compensation? No, it does not. We've talked about that. So where in the listing agreement does the seller commit to paying a certain amount as seller concessions? There is no obligation. You would use the form MLSA, multiple listing seller addendum, and all it is just a question, would you like to pay concessions? But it's not binding. It's just an opinion of what they're willing to do, as a matter of fact. Let's see. And we talked about, how does a buyer who is committed to paying their own agent request that the seller compensate their agent? Well, through section 3G3 of the RPA, you can request that the seller pay the buyer's broker's commission, and you would attach SPBV, seller payment of buyer's broker, to that. And then, Gina, this gets back to your question. If the buyer writes into their offer request for seller concessions, is the amount of the seller concessions limited to the amount of compensation as stated in the buyer representation agreement? Yes, it is. And section item 13, remember, if you break out commissions paid to the buyer's broker versus concessions, the commissions paid by the seller to the buyer's broker does not fall with the concession category as a lender would review it. So that's beneficial for your buyer, because the concessions could be capped. And then if the seller is authorized a listing agent to disclose that the seller is willing to pay compensation to the buyer's broker, or even specified an exact amount of seller credits on an MLS as a seller concession, is the seller then bound to pay that promised amount once the buyer has requested in the RPA? No, they're not. And then this is important, since the buyer's agent is not permitted to receive compensation beyond the amount negotiated in their buyer representation agreement. So Gina, it doesn't say less. You just can't collect more. I'll get an answer to that. I think that's a very good question. So you can't collect anything more that's what's in that representation agreement. And then also, once again, let's assume the buyer requests that the seller pay the buyer's broker a certain amount of commissions. The seller can counter that and negotiate that. So they don't have to agree to it necessarily. And let's assume I have a 3% buyer representation agreement. Seller only agrees to pay 2%. The buyer's obligated to pay 1%. Now, can we credit that back to them, Gina? Gets back to your question. I can't say 100% that I know the answer to that. So that's it for today. How about any other questions?
Jeff has a question at the
Okay.
bottom of the last one there.
On the new listing agreement, do you need an addendum that the start listing date and the effective date on the MLS is different, or maybe an MT? So if now, I mean, before the former listing contract, I had a beginning date of today, but I wasn't going to start marketing it until September 1st. Under section 7, the start marketing date, you could fill that in, say I'm going to start marketing it September 1st. You'd have to register that listing. Now, if you're going to do that, those same clauses are found in an addendum to the listing contract called Form MLSA. And on the MLSA, that's where you would insert a start marketing date if it's different than the beginning date. So does everybody understand what I'm talking about in regards to the beginning date of the contract, the listing contract versus the start marketing date? If not, let me just revise it, go through that. So if we were to take a listing contract, and it could have changed now, but typically in line 3, it has a beginning date of the contract. So if I state it's today, no matter who sells that property, I'm entitled to commission. But I may have a beginning date of today, but realistically, the sellers aren't prepared to put the house on the market until September 1st. So the start marketing date would be September 1st. I'm still protected because I have a beginning date of today. The start marketing date is the time that I must put it on the MLS, or by that time I must put it on the MLS. So 2 different things. So the beginning date of the contract where I'm protected, and the time we're actually going to put the property on the market are 2 different time frames. And if we have a time frame that's different between the beginning date and the start marketing date, we have to register that listing. And when it goes to an active status, then we convert that registered listing to an active listing.
How about buying agreements?
Oh, what now?
Buying agreements.
Uh-huh.
Can we sign something that we say that we start doing the marketing from this date?
And a buyer
Future date.
representation agreement or a listing contract? You said a buying
Buyer
agreement.
representation.
Okay.
agreement. Because you said only it's 3 months.
Uh-huh.
So can I have it for the future?
I would assume you can. I don't know why you do that. I think I would just take the agreement. What you can do, it can't be for more than 3 months, but you can extend it.
You mean
So,
every 3 months?
Yes, you can
it.
extend that buyer representation agreement every 3 months.
No, the reason I asked, for instance, if I sign a listing agreement, and the client has a 1031 that want to market it in 1 month from now.
Uh-huh.
So can I have the buyer representation also 1 month from now?
I don't see why you can't. Yeah, because it just says on the buyer representation agreement, section A1, beginning on. Yeah. So you're not going to do anything for them in the meantime?
Yeah, and also
You said you're not.
I'm extending 1 month instead of 3 months that it started from now. It started from the day that the other one would go on the market.
I have to say I'm lost with that question. So,
I wanna sign a leasing agreement
Hmm.
for a client
Okay.
that wanna put her property in a market.
Hmm.
But it's an investment property, so she wanna do a 1031. But she doesn't plan to do it now until 1 month.
to list it, right?
Yes.
Okay, so you can
But
specify that future date.
I wanna make sure that, I sign everything, so later on she wouldn't accept the agreement with another agent.
Well, that's why you should have on a listing contract, you should say the beginning date is today. So you're protected if they try and sell it, but say the start marketing date is October 1st. That's what I would do to protect myself as a listing agent. And you register it if the start marketing date is different than the beginning date. But you can also make a beginning date stating October 1st, but between now and October 1st, if they sell their property, you're entitled to nothing.
And then response to SPVP, whoever submits on that listing. I'm representing a seller, let's say, a buyer submits SPVP, asking for 3%, seller pays 3% commission. If I want to negotiate that, or seller comes back with that 2%, can I negotiate for, like an addendum or?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, you can. There's no form to negotiate the buyer's broker's commissions. It's just an addendum or a counter offer. Yeah, exactly. You can negotiate that.
And then Giselle has a question.
Okay. What about when you are selling off market and have a single party agreement signed for seller to pay a certain amount for representing both the buyer and seller? Do you still need to have a buyer representation agreement signed? Well, you can have a single party. You can't show the property. That's a good question. If it's not on the MLS, do the rules apply to us showing the property? That's a good question. I would say that's questionable. I don't know. When you have a single party compensation agreement that the seller is going to pay, there's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to represent the buyer, but then you should have a buyer non-agency agreement signed if you're simply representing the seller. Does that answer your question? So selling off market. So how are you selling an off market property? Do you have a listing contract? And if you don't have a listing contract, you're not entitled to advertise that property.
Richard,
So,
can you hear me?
okay.
Can you hear me?
Giselle, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, can you hear me?
Can't hear you, Giselle.
Hi,
Oh,
can you,
is she muted?
She's not muted.
It's a mute. Oh, that's to mute her.
Yeah.
Okay.
so can you guys hear me? You can hear me, huh?
Well, I guess if it's a property that is, let's assume it's a FSBO, maybe that's where you find out is for sale. You can actually submit a single party compensation agreement. I don't know why you can't hear me. I'm not sure either. Do we have the speakers turned up?
Speakers are turned up. I don't know
Okay.
if the volume on your actual computer.
On my computer. Let me see. Maybe that's the problem. That's probably the reason.
Try again, Giselle.
Hi, Richard, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. That was my mistake. Thank you.
Okay, so in this situation, I have a property that I may be able to sell off market. My client hasn't seen it. I'm going to see the seller today, and I have a buyer for it. And I just want to know, like he agreed to sign a single party agreement with me. I already know that buyer for many years, and I know she would like to buy this property. So I just want to make sure, just signing a single party agreement. I'm asking him to pay me 4%, representing both him and the buyer, my buyer, who I have known for like many years. And I just want to make sure that's good enough.
Well, I think in a single party compensation agreement, you can state that you're representing the seller, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can do that. And then you would have, if you're not going to represent the buyer, you would have the buyer sign a buyer non-agency agreement.
I'm representing the buyer and seller.
Okay, then if you're going to represent the buyer, I would say no matter what, you are going to need a buyer representation agreement. And you can actually, so you would specify the commission the buyer's obligated to pay, and you would also have the seller sign a single party compensation agreement specifically for that buyer.
So in that case, I have to split the commission, or I just put one on the seller side?
Well, not that you have to split the commission with anyone, but
No, split it between the buyer representation agreement and the single party listing agreement.
well, actually, what I would do is just when you submit the offer, just negotiate that the seller pays the buyer's compensation. And I'm not sure if I'm giving you the right answer here.
Well, it's making it really complicated, right?
Yeah, it's on the single party compensation, it's gonna obligate the seller to pay the commission.
Because
You
I'd be
could.
happy with seller paying me 4%, so I don't know, like, what this buyer representation agreement, it's just make it complicated.
Yeah, it may, but what you could do, because we don't want you showing a property to a buyer. So one of two things, you'd have to have a buyer non-agency agreement signed, but I don't know if that's gonna be protecting you in the event of touring a property. I think you're going to have, no matter what, the PSRA, the property showing agreement signed, and you could have the buyer state $1. That's the compensation they're going to be owing you. So you can have the single party compensation agreement signed first by the seller for this particular buyer, have the BRBC or PSRA signed by the buyer for $1 of compensation for that particular property. So get the SP signed first, the single party compensation agreement signed first. And that way you're protected.
And you make it.
All right, thank you.
Okay. All right, one last question. Can we send out an email blast to agents in our office before the marketing date? And can we tell anyone else to show it? So I think the question is, Jeff is saying we have a beginning date of today. We have a start marketing date of October 1st. Yes, for registered property, and that's something that we would be registering with the MLS. We can actually share that information with everybody under the same broker's license. So yes, we can share that information. As a matter of fact, when it's registered, assuming you have an agency disclosure signed, you can actually show that property. Unlike coming soon, when it's in a coming soon status, the property cannot be shown. So yes, Jeff, you can disseminate that among the office. Okay. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. Any other questions before we wrap it up? No, Gina? No, go ahead, Gina. They might be interested.
Yesterday, I received an email in regards to litigation. The class action notifications going out to all the sellers, right? You're familiar with that.
Actually, I received one and we had that sent out to the office,
Yeah,
right?
and I got that one too.
Okay.
Another one yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
So I was kind of reading through it, and then I don't think I quite ever understood how our specific brokerage is covered, or how my membership with NAR is covered through the settlement.
Why you're not going to be subject to any other litigation currently. So for a company that does, unfortunately, less than $2 billion a year in revenues, and we're not at that threshold yet. We're included in the settlement. So every single member of these multiple listing services is included in regards to the release that's granted under the settlement.
So
We're included, yes. Yes. At one time, Berkshire Hathaway was not included, so they're actually paying separately. They thought they could beat this and then opted to change their position on it. So they wouldn't have been included. They are not. Warren has money.
Lots of CDs.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions? No.
You could draw a few cards.
Okay. Oh, that's right. That's right. For those that are here,
They're all in there.
has everybody turned in their
Yep.
business card?
I went around.
Okay, great. James, I'm gonna make sure yours is in here. Everybody liked James's haircut. It's pretty cool.
Yes, yeah.